Hey everyone, JP here with a quick follow-up to our spec deal video from last month. First off, thanks for all the views and comments. Really glad to see how my experience in the industry resonated with so many. If you haven't seen it yet, please check it out, and remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. One thing I briefly mentioned in that video was how the prevalence of home recording and spec deals put an end to most label-funded development, which had been a mainstay for decades by the old regime of the industry. What I didn't emphasize enough was how important development or demo projects were to the overall recording studio economy, and how losing this business, along with the rise of home recording, was really a double-edged sword for many studios. Walk into any multi-room facility in New York City or Los Angeles in the 90s, and you'd encounter three main types of clientele. The big budget major label productions that would camp out in a room for months at a time, top mix engineer room lockouts, which could go on for years, and the daily or short-term projects that were typically funded by development money. I'll leave out the smaller private or independently funded projects, as they were a much smaller percentage of the overall business. The weekend warrior fantasy camp stuff was never enough for a studio to rely on. Of course, the bread and butter of the industry were the major label album productions, usually locking out a large tracking room for several months at a time. 2 to 3 months was probably about average for a modern rock album, but there were always exceptions. I spent 6 months with Dream Theater in 2001 just on tracking for a double album, but they were also writing it in the studio as well as recording. Metallica leveraged extensive studio time into two different studios renovating their facilities just for them, the Plant in Sausalito and Quad in New York City for the Load and Reload album sessions. In very rare cases, you'd have artists like Michael Jackson and Guns N' Roses booking studios for years on end, resulting in two of the most expensive albums ever made. But the studio managers I knew really loved the mix engineer lockouts best. Generally, they were the lowest drama, a consistent day-to-day lunch pail type work ethic, and usually less of the needy diva artists hanging around than tracking sessions would have. Kevin Shirley's room at Hit Factory and Avatar before that come to mind, as well as Andy Wallace at Soundtrack, Michael Brower at Electric Lady, Jack Joseph Puig at Ocean Way, and Tom Lord Alge in South Beach, just to name a few. As these names were in demand for years, if not decades, and the cost of a studio was baked into their mixing rates, studio managers were more than happy to host and accommodate these guys if they were lucky enough to land one. Now, for the final 30 to 35% of the studio business economy, we have the daily or short-term projects that were often funded by labels for artist development. Maybe this was a producer spending a few days tracking with an artist to test their chemistry together, or a mix engineer needing a space to do a test mix in hopes of landing a full project. Maybe it was just a weekend session suggested by A&R to gauge how a prospective artist would handle themselves in that environment. Sometimes to determine if a vocalist needed more coaching or a drummer needed more practice with a click track before a larger investment was made. And if we're being frank, it was also a way to spot any hard drugs or other bad habits before they became an issue. I've seen bands told they wouldn't go any further unless a drummer or other member was replaced or a vocalist cleaned up their act. The pressure of recording in a large studio with a named producer could be a lot for a young band that hadn't had much experience yet. Of course, a lot of red flags were ignored as well. Sometimes the development came after signing a deal, like the aforementioned Guns N' Roses, who spent nearly 2 years developing their sound before Appetite for Destruction was released, an eternity by modern standards. It took tremendous patience, no pun intended, and belief by their label Geffen, as the band recorded demos with several producers before finding the right fit for their sound. If that process had been rushed, they might have been just another 80s LA band that got moved to the bargain bin when grunge took over. And in songwriter-driven genres like country, R&B, and pop, a demo deal could be paired with a publishing deal, with the idea of using high-level production to showcase a song's potential to bigger artists. This kind of work probably accounts for over 50% of the Nashville studio business and still remains strong. Occasionally, a well-produced demo that the writer performs on could lead to a songwriter becoming one of those artists themselves, Chris Stapleton, but often the most prolific writers remain behind the scenes. This is rare in rock music in general, though, and never really caught on in the New York City studio scene, so I can't speak much on it for lack of personal experience. A lot of development projects never made it beyond that initial demo stage, and the results were shelved. It's unfortunate that sometimes great potential was wasted due to a label not being able to find the right producer pairing or environment to express an artist's creativity, with the ink of a deal in place to prevent that artist from moving elsewhere. I've heard several well-known engineers state that only half the work they ever did actually came out, and can concur with that from my own experiences. All of it paid the bills for studios and us engineers, though, regardless. Now, back to the studio business. This type of short-term demo session booking may seem like small potatoes for a large studio compared to the big budget lockout projects we mentioned. But as any business owner knows, maximizing that last 30% or so can be the difference between breaking out of the red and into the black for the year, especially in the two largest cities in the country with the highest overhead in terms of rent, staff, and equipment needs. This type of work disappeared a lot faster than the larger projects did, about 5 years ahead of the overall studio decline, as the shift towards home-produced spec work took this expense off the record label books for good. Even in its golden age, living day-to-day on studio revenue was never a great prospect, and it was often these unheard sessions that kept the industry busy. I don't think many people realize just how slim the margins were for large studios, even during the height of the industry. Sure, a daily room rate of $2,000 or more sounds crazy today, but consider that you've got a manager on payroll, several assistant managers or receptionists to handle things around the clock, at least one staff recording engineer, high-level assistant engineers who could double as session engineers when needed, runners, interns who often doubled as janitors and cleaning crew back then, plus a technical maintenance staff that were often the highest paid employees in the building and on call 24/7. That 2K is already being stretched pretty thin, even with several rooms booked. And let's not even get into the electric bill to keep everything turned on and air conditioned. It's long been joked, the best way to end up with $1 million in the music business is to start with 2 million, and that certainly can be said for studio ownership. Much like the restaurant industry, I always felt like studios were the perfect spots to launder money and write off expenses for owners of questionable means, where losing money isn't as much of a concern as it would be for the rest of us. Unfortunately, many of the great rooms of yesterday are gone, and with the trend of producers and mixers using their home studios to work within the budgets of today's industry, it's a shame that an entire generation of musicians will miss out on that incredible big studio experience. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. I'll be back with more on music production, the recording industry, and of course guitar amps very soon.